So here we go. Welcome. As you may know, it's Transit Month, our 6th annual celebration of transit riders, and our transit heroes. You can learn more if you don't know already at transitmonth.org. Even though there's only one day left technically in the month, you can still log your transit rides for your chance to win some great prizes in our transit ride raffle. We're also on Friday night having an in-person outdoors vaccinated celebration of our Bay Area Rider First Awards. We'll be honoring several advocates and some folks who work behind the scenes to make life better for all transit riders. I'm really excited for that, and I hope you can join us there. You can find more information again at transitmonth.org. As you may know, San Francisco Transit Riders is powered by our members. Please help support great events like this one. If you're not a member yet, you can join at our website, sftransitriders.org/donate. And with that, let me introduce our moderator for tonight, Camille Guiriba. She has been on the board of San Francisco Transit Riders for 3 years now. She's been a great asset there. She's also a senior transportation planner at the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. You may know her from some very exciting projects that are currently going on in the city. And with that, I will hand it over to Camille.
Thank you, Kat. And I have the great privilege of moderating an awesome panel of women who are here to speak to our topic today of reducing emissions and improving transit. First off, Sarah Jones is the planning director at the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency and describes her role as seeing that our streets, transit, and mobility options are providing what San Francisco needs. Prior to joining the SFMTA 5 years ago, she was leading environmental review for the planning department. And in that capacity, she had the opportunity to be at the helm of San Francisco, becoming the first city in California to transition from level of service to vehicle miles traveled as the key metric. A very wonky change that helps advance transit and climate goals, but very important milestone for the city in that respect. Sarah grew up in New York City and is a lifelong transit rider, although she's now added an e-bike as a top travel option. And she and her husband raised 2 kids in San Francisco and feel lucky to have everything San Francisco has to offer, especially Muni, in their lives. Next on our panel, we have Debbie Raphael. She's the director of the San Francisco Department of the Environment and believes that cities can take bold action to address environmental harm. A scientist by training and a public servant by profession, Debbie has spent most of her career working in government to ensure that everyone has an equal right to safe and healthy environment. Under the leadership of Mayor Breed and the Board of Supervisors, she helped pass one of the city's most groundbreaking bans on natural gas in new construction, implemented a new accelerated goal of carbon neutrality by 2040, and updated the city's climate action plan in collaboration with residents, community-based organizations, and businesses to include specific goals and strategies in critical sectors of energy, materials, biodiversity, and of course, transportation. Named one of the world's 100 most influential people in climate policy, Debbie is a frequent keynote speaker at the international climate conferences and a national spokesperson on environmental issues. And the last person on our panel is Theresa Winnery. She is a senior transportation planner at Fehr & Pierce's San Francisco office, where she leads the company's transportation demand management practice. Her specialty lies at the intersection of land use and transportation and includes research on how and why people choose to travel the way they do and the types of infrastructure and services that influence those decisions. She has been working closely with the San Francisco's Office of Environmental Planning for 7 years and was proud to assist in the update of the city's transportation impact analysis guidelines. In addition to her work in San Francisco, she has worked on statewide initiatives to address carbon reduction, from the transportation sector with the Air Resources Board and has worked with SACMET and ICF Consulting to update methodology used in the California Emissions Estimator Model. So those are our three panelists for today, and we'll jump right into the first question for Director Raphael. Can you set the stage, Debbie, and walk us through a high-level summary of San Francisco's climate goals, where we are, how we got there, what is the Department of the Environment's role, and what does it mean to declare a climate emergency? And what is a climate action plan that was mentioned as part of your bio? So lots of parts of that question. You'll have a lot of time to speak to all of those.
Wow. Thanks, Camille. Yeah, hello, everyone. I am so honored to be here. I am not a transportation expert, so I am really happy that you've got three transportation experts on the panel with me, but I am a deeply committed environmental scientist and honored to be with you tonight talking about what is truly one of the biggest challenges for our city when it comes to addressing our contribution to greenhouse gases. And that is, of course, gasoline and diesel. So San Francisco has a long history of bold environmental action. We do not shy away from being the first. We do not shy away from taking risks. We are one of the first to ban plastic bags or styrofoam. We've just banned natural gas in new construction. We understand what I like to call San Francisco the bubble inside the bubble, where the bubble is California and the San Francisco Bay Area is the bubble inside that bubble. So we have this opportunity to be bold, but what comes along is a responsibility to take action. If we don't do it here, where is it going to happen? So the way I like to summarize climate action strategy for San Francisco is in 4 simple words or concepts: 0, 80, 100 routes. 0, 80, 100 routes. All right, 0. That means 0 waste to landfill or incineration, 0 toxics, getting to a circular economy. 80% of trips in low carbon efficient modes. That means get out of your car. Let's take transit, let's walk, let's bike. Let's figure out how we get around without single occupancy vehicles. 100, that's 100% renewable energy. So that means that we're going to have 100% renewable electricity, but it also means we get off of all fossil fuels. So no more diesel, gasoline, or natural gas. It's an all electric city run on 100% renewable electricity. That's 0, 80, 100. And I like to say that if we do 0, 80, 100, if we achieve it, we've done less bad in the world, but we haven't healed the planet because, as you all know on this call, already there's too much carbon in the atmosphere right now. So even if we stopped our emissions, we'd still have global warming and climate change and all of the impacts. We have to pull CO2 out of the air, and we do that through roots. We do that by planting trees, supporting biodiversity within our city, and we do that even more impactfully by using our green bin to its max, which means take all of our organic waste, change it into compost, put that compost on agriculture and rangeland, radically change soil chemistry. When we do that, the soil then becomes a carbon sink and we pull CO2 out of the air. So 0, 80, 100 routes, that's the city's climate action strategy. And of course, that 80 is what we're going to talk about today. So how are we doing? Well, you know, we're doing really well. We're actually 6 years ahead of schedule, which is kind of amazing. We did our last inventory in 2019. We just certified it. So this is pre-pandemic. We set 1990 as our baseline year. So since 1990, San Francisco has reduced its emissions of greenhouse gases by 41%. 41%, that we were hoping to get there by 2030. So we're well ahead of where we thought we needed to go. But of course, we now know that we have to go even faster than we are. But the amazing thing about that 41% is that we've done it at the same time that our GDP has grown by 199% and our population by 22%. So what's really important about that statistic that I just said is that bubble inside the bubble concept, that lead by example, where we're showing people, we're showing the world that you can have a thriving economy and be environmentally responsible and reduce your emissions. So we know it's code red for humanity. The UN gave us the report not too long ago. We knew it was a climate emergency. We passed our own emergency in 2019. We're moving ahead to implement those things we know we need to do, but we need a roadmap. And so what the Department of the Environment has been doing with the MTA, with the CTA, with the PUC, with the port, the airport, the planning department, with our community partners, is putting together that roadmap in the shape of a climate action plan. And that climate action plan will be launched to the public in early December. I'm incredibly excited about it. A plan is a roadmap. It shows us all the strategies that we need to do. I like to say that there is nothing mysterious about what the city of San Francisco needs to do to solve its climate action problem. It's not a question of what we need to do, it's how, and do we have the political will? So I'm very honored to be here as part of the Department of Environment. Our role is to convene, cajole, congratulate, all of those things that we do to bring people together to do what we need to do to build that political will, to take the action that we all know we need to take. So thanks, Camille.
Thanks, Debbie. Yeah, definitely glad to hear that of the progress we've made with the 41% reduction in GHGs since 1990. I think, and obviously we still have our work cut out for us, which I'm glad the work on the climate action plan is identifying what our specific steps by each department will be and by each sector. And so I think that's where we want to really hone in, given the audience we have today, on the transportation aspect of that and the 80% low carbon trip goal that we have as part of the 080-100 routes framework that the Department of Environment has given us. And so I'll turn over to Sarah Jones, if you can kind of put those citywide goals and that context into the transportation world that we have to deal with. What's our progress on those 80% low carbon trips? And what do you see some of the biggest challenges in meeting that goal?
Yeah, thank you so much, Camille. And I also thank you, Debbie. I actually don't see myself as a transportation expert either. I am a place expert, and transportation is an integral part of place. I really appreciate a lot of the things that Debbie just said and the themes she brought up, because I think that they're really important themes that are going to carry through what all of us say tonight. So we will dive into that. Camille, you asked about focusing on that 80% number and that 80% low carbon trips number. And I'll start with just the overall matter of transportation related goals, and then we can talk a little bit more about that 80% number. So, there are multiple goals related to transportation and climate together, and they're meaningful at different levels. And as Debbie said, we have to be a leader within the state when it comes to taking all those actions around greenhouse gas emissions. And that's really important because of how we fit as San Francisco and as a major employment center and destination city and residential city into that overall Bay Area ecosystem, and then in turn into the statewide ecosystem. So the whole matter of greenhouse gas emissions is super, super important in all of the work that California is doing. Then there are a whole bunch of other transportation related goals that I think everybody on this call feels extremely strongly about, namely safety, equity, the livability of our streets and our city, and basically just being able to get around to where you need to go and what you want to do. And those are goals that that also have a very strong nexus to climate, and that we need to consider within the whole range of things. So it's not just a matter of reducing emissions, it's a matter of having a whole transportation system that is really supporting a whole bunch of different goals, essentially. You know, a really key thing that we have to understand as we do this work and go through all of the difficult steps that it takes to move into using transit and active transportation modes more and more is that we all have to understand that cars make our streets just hostile and difficult places, kind of fundamentally, especially when you're talking about a city like San Francisco that is so dense, and where you need to be able to support people being able to get around in ways other than cars. You know, we really need to think about not just what's coming out of the tailpipe of our transportation modes, when those tailpipes exist at all, but really kind of every decision that we make about our streets and about our right-of-way needs to recognize the role of efficiency in moving people around and in using that space well, so that they are spaces that are welcoming and that are providing the access that's needed for everybody. And you know, it's a cycle. If the streets are hostile and difficult, it makes it you know, not very pleasant to get on a bus or to get around by bike, and so then that's, you know, kind of making cars that much more attractive, which just makes it that much harder to crack that nut of our transportation component of our goals. So really, that's what makes transit so key in this whole story, is that really nothing else works if you don't get efficiency, and you can get the best efficiency for people getting around and the best achievement of various other goals and equity related goals if transit is working well. A dense but car-oriented city, which in a lot of ways is what we have, is just a deeply inequitable place because of that inefficiency. So that's why when we are working together with Debbie's team, we're really talking about electrification and electric vehicles, as well as all of these other transportation goals, and have a great partnership around them. Now, in terms of how we're doing, we are, you know, this, as I mentioned, has been one of the toughest areas of our emissions to bring down. There's just a very complicated interplay, even as people do, you know, use non-auto modes. We are a growing city, and there are a lot of trips, and we're a very unaffordable city, so those trips get longer, and they're hard to do. So we've been hovering around 50% of these non-auto transportation modes. To be honest, we're not going in the right direction at the moment. And that's something that is a really big focus within the Climate Action Plan, is trying to move back into the other direction. The low carbon trip metric is something that we're trying to develop and grow our understanding. We've always talked about sustainable trips. And that's where we started to get into, okay, we're trying to do too many things with the term sustainable, because we're trying to talk about greenhouse gas emissions and all of these other aspects of our transportation goals. So we're moving into a little bit more nuanced assessment of understanding emissions as one set of metrics. And then we're going to be bringing forward an efficiency related metric as well. So that's kind of exciting stuff that has started to, that we are starting to roll out and really work on and advance. So keep your eye on that in the coming months.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. I really appreciated how you mentioned that, yeah, we can't just electrify, we need to, you centered transit as an important part of the solution to kind of meet our goals related to transportation. And I also liked how you pointed out how the nexus of climate goals with other goals that the city has, like equity. And, you know, I know there's a lot of research about how climate impacts are being bared mostly by, or more so for communities of color or communities with concentrations of low income. So I think that's an important nexus to think about as we think about climate issues and transportation. And I think the last point I wanted to highlight from what you just said was just thinking about the evolution of the low carbon trip metric. And I look forward to seeing how we evolve measuring that in the future, because it is a nuanced thing where some things become electric. There's people carpooling, and who knows with automation what will happen next and all that. So lots of things to keep in mind, and we need to evolve our metrics to keep up with the trends of transportation. And so I'll move my next question to Teresa. Teresa, as I mentioned in her bio, has worked across the state. And so I was hoping, Teresa, you could give us some statewide context of the range of discussions other cities or government agencies are having, and what their plans are for enacting changes for their governments.
Absolutely. First off, it's a pleasure to be here and talking to a bunch of transit enthusiasts. Always love it. And when it comes to my perspective, I really do come from more of a statewide focus and very much a travel behavior change focus. So I've been fortunate in the past couple of years to be involved with a couple of statewide research efforts that are really focused on how different transportation strategies, including those that enhance transit, can help reduce carbon emissions in the transportation sector. So we all know that's the state's single largest contributing sector. That's what we're here to talk about today. And most of what I work on focuses on that interplay between land use and transportation. So the research that I mentioned started in 2017 with the California Air Resource Board, looking at the Zero Carbon Buildings Feasibility Study, which took an array of folks from across different sectors to take a look at what it means for a building to be truly zero carbon if you include all of those transportation trips to and from the site, which is not typically how many buildings people think about carbon emissions. And so what we were able to discover through that, and also just kind of talking with some really great experts from the buildings world, the electrification world, is that yes, electrification and just general fuel efficiency are hugely important for reducing transportation sector emissions, but they're also, absent some major changes, going to be on a very long time frame. The lifespan of a vehicle and the level of turnover in our vehicle fleets is very low. And so to rest entirely on electrification requires kind of a much longer time span than maybe thinking through how we might be able to improve our transportation systems in an operational sense. So as we worked through this, we really just tried to break down strategies into different types. You have your traditional kind of, commute benefits programs, but then we also included a number of strategies that look specifically at changes in the transportation network. So that might be increasing the frequency on a bus line or across a bus network on average. It might be reducing transit fares. It might be having more concentrated subsidies. And then on the other end, we had a fair number of land use strategies that were included. Things like making sure that you have dense development, a good mix of land uses, that you are building things near transit and near other destinations that people want to go to. And from that, we kind of pull away that, first of all, there's a limited body of evidence for many of these strategies. There haven't been a lot of studies on before and after, and really kind of looking academically at how individual changes might change people's behavior. But the overall takeaways that we found were that A, land use is incredibly important. B, that time is really people's most valued resource when it comes to travel. It's the #1 thing that they're going to consider whenever they're deciding how to make a trip. And between those two items, we really have 3 ways to enhance the competitiveness of transit and walking and biking relative to private automobiles. The first one is really to just provide more frequent transit service. The second is to provide transit service that goes to the places that people need to go. And just as important is to develop the types of places people need to go near that transit service, and also to just stop prioritizing the convenience of drivers above all other concerns, to really try to equalize the level of time and effort that it takes to travel from point A to point B, or more importantly, to get X activity done on transit versus via car, or on bike versus via car. And when we talk about land use, the number one item that really influences it is really making sure that we are providing a sensible amount of parking given the urban context that we want to create. We find that providing less parking is kind of the single easiest one plot of land solution that could potentially result in fewer vehicle trips overall, especially when we're looking at residential parking, because it affects vehicle ownership rates. In terms of what's going on in the state at large, we are seeing these sorts of principles being built into more and more general plans, mostly in larger cities. And honestly, in a lot of the other kind of large cities in the Bay Area, LA to a certain extent, but San Francisco really is still at the forefront as a city. I've been incredibly impressed with what's going on here and how much will there has been in order to really try to implement and focus on these things that we think are going to be the most effective ways to get things done. You know, there's a dearth of kind of mechanisms in many cases in order to make sure that these items are being funded correctly, that we're able to kind of get them implemented without getting weighed down by process. And aside from that, I think the other major change in statewide policy has been the implementation of Senate Bill 743. So that is the storied change from vehicle level of service or vehicle delay to vehicle miles traveled. And as we've worked with more and more cities who are implementing SB 743, which San Francisco did before anyone else, we've really found a lot of confusion, a lot of like people thinking about this in a way that they've never thought about it before, that I think will overall be really valuable at the state level.
Thanks, Teresa. I think that perspective of what's going on with the state guidance and elsewhere in the state really, you know, sometimes when we're here in our San Francisco bubble, we feel like we're not making a lot of progress, but to know that the policies we've had on parking and like are still ahead of the game, it's good to hear. But I think that is a common theme I've heard from all the panelists, is like really, you know, we need to continue our leadership to address these issues and reduce the impact of transportation on climate. And so with that, going back to Director Raphael, what are some of your top priorities for San Francisco in the next 5 to 10 years to meet our climate goals?
Thank you. And, you know, the thing is, the answer to that question is not developed in a vacuum. So the Department of the Environment doesn't sit there and think about what the most important things are. We really do ask the experts and listen to as many different voices as we can. And I say that because what I'm going to say is going to sound a lot like what Sarah and Teresa might say as well. And that's not an accident. That's the strength of a climate action plan that is rooted and aligned with the best thinking on these subjects. The first thing I want to say about priorities is I talked about 0-80-100 routes as sort of this shorthand for mitigation, what we call mitigation strategies, ways to decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. All of those actions are looked at and prioritized through the lens of equity and through the lens of health. So when Sarah talks about these other goals that go aligned with the benefits of reducing emissions, we also think about that when we start to put our top priorities in place. They are there for emissions, and they are for what we call in wonky world, co-benefits, but it literally is, as Sarah talked about it, other goals that are so important for us to have, frankly, a city that we would want to live in. So here are the top ones that came out of the Climate Action Plan. The first is our energy supply. We have got to get all electric, get off of fossil fuels, and be supplied by 100% renewable electricity. And those fossil fuels, some are easier to get off of than others. We have a path forward for natural gas. It's still going to be very expensive in existing buildings. We understand what it means to get off of diesel and gasoline in trucks and in delivery vans, as well as off-road vehicles, as well as cars. So we need to electrify all of that. The second is something that Teresa was really talking about, and that is land use, housing, how the structure of our city is going to support the ability to be all electric, to get off of fossil fuels. These things are inextricably linked, land use and fossil fuel use. So density and mixed use development near transit, compact infill housing near transit, all of those things elevate when we're talking about the ability to become an all-electric city in a manner that gives us that feeling of being a community we would want to live in. And in terms of transportation, the modeling that the CTA, your organization, Camille, as well as Sarah and the MTA, as well as our consulting world, has shown us that there are pretty much three top strategies. One is congestion, and this gets into, I wrote down, I liked the decrease the prioritization of the convenience of drivers. I just love that phrase, Teresa. And it just has got so many impacts on it. And so one of that is congestion pricing, that we use pricing signals to the drivers to say, you know what, you shouldn't be coming in here with a car. It's not your right to come into downtown for free in the middle of the day. The other is to get what we call mode shift, to enable the public transportation and active transportation. We need to do everything we can to strengthen our transit system. The other major one, it has to do with parking. And again, this is something Teresa talked about. San Francisco has led the way, having parking maximums instead of parking minimums in new construction. But there's a lot more we can do to deprioritize the convenience of drivers around parking. And there's a lot in the Climate Action Plan about that. And finally, I mean, we really do also, it's an and, not an or, we have to electrify anything that is on the road. So if anyone is in a car still, those cars have to be electric. All those delivery vehicles, all those trucks, everything has got to be electric. So those are the top strategies that our Climate Action Plan is going to call for.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie, for pointing out kind of those most very impactful strategies that you've already identified in the Climate Action Plan, you know, with the congestion pricing being a key one. And my colleagues at the Transportation Authority have been working on that study to see different configurations for the downtown cordon. And yeah, glad to hear that it's modeling well in terms of reducing reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And you know, that goes back to what Teresa said, is like, how do we level the playing field of like having non-auto modes compete with auto modes? And that definitely is one tool that we are preparing in our toolbox to be able to do that. And so going to Sarah Jones, to achieve our long-term climate goals, we know we need to get people back on transit, and we've lost a lot of riders during the pandemic. How is MTA addressing this, and what gives you hope?
Thanks a lot, Camille. And you know, I know that the issue of ridership after the pandemic and service return and all of these questions about you know, just people feeling comfortable and safe and making transit part of their lives again, whether their lives look like they did before or not. Those are really, really key questions that that my colleagues are engaged in. You know, particularly right now, what's very intense is the context of the near-term stuff of like, we have some, very real and severe operational limitations right now with, with staffing constraints, et cetera, that are affecting our ability with bringing service back in the near term. And, we are having to do that in the context of longer term, long standing budgetary challenges. So it is absolutely not an easy job. And, we are very, very mindful of how important that service return is to getting ridership back up. It's, these things play together a lot. But for this discussion about kind of how are we going to get to where we need to go climate-wise, I want to talk about sort of the longer term prospects and the longer term thinking around that from the place where we are now. So I mentioned, our longstanding budgetary issues, and that is particularly around the operating budget. So one thing that is really important to understand is just how different it is to fund infrastructure, versus the funding of, running the bus system or running any kind of system day to day, and the staff to do that and all the pieces. And the revenue sources for those are very, very different. And have different kinds of challenges and different kind of stakeholders. And, we have had a deficit around our operations for a long time. And it looks a particular way in San Francisco because we're one agency that handles both streets and transit, but it's, this is a common problem for any kind of service or utility is that operational gap. And, it has been very difficult to develop the interest and the energy that is needed to fund these kinds of operations. And really, this is kind of another way that our structural racism and our inequities play out. There are a lot of stakeholders who get really excited about funding the stuff and funding the infrastructure, and they are varied and they're powerful. But the stakeholders for funding operations are the people who are depending on those operations. And that tends to be a much less powerful group of people who are depending on transit because they need it to live, all of the aspects of their very complicated lives. And it's just this really, it's this really challenging situation that is at the core of, and dealing with it is at the core of dealing with getting people onto transit. Because it's about making transit usable for what people need. And one of the things that that we really saw during the pandemic, and that we are seeing as an opportunity in our thinking rather than a limitation, is what is the role of transit for trips other than the commute trip? The downtown commute is it's such a big load. Pre-pandemic, that was such a big load, and that really drove a lot of thinking about both transit infrastructure and transit operations. And now we've seen, all of the different ways that people need and rely on transit. That's become a much bigger picture of the ridership. And now we kind of have this opportunity to recognize that and think about that and plan for that. Because basically, getting more trips to happen by transit depends on making it possible for more trips to happen by transit. So we need to kind of move from this idea of a downtown commute as the focus to, a vision of being able to get wherever you want to go 24/7 on transit. And that really ties to some of the things that Debbie was talking about with what's near transit and what you do, and thinking about that whole system holistically. So, you know, a big effort that we have is around, you know, planning for new revenue sources and working for that, and together building that vision of how we get money and how we should be spending it. And, you know, in a lot of our planning, like with our strategic plan, et cetera, we're really able to do that better because we are focusing on these equity related issues, these usability related issues, you know, and are kind of having that space to listen to what people are saying about what they want instead of, you know, what we're, you know, assuming from where we sit within the system that people want and need. But really, I think it's going to be on all of us together in the end to get people back onto transit. You know, we need to have that kind of broad support and engagement and value for transit to be able to together build a system that is as usable for people as it can possibly be.
Thanks, Sarah. You know, I think a lot of what you touched on is a lot of the work that San Francisco Transit Riders is very much focused on. I think with our 30 by 30 vision, that is not just about getting downtown, it's about getting across the city, you know, quickly, easily on transit. We are also part of, you know, regional coalition to advocate for more funding for transit, especially for operating funds. And so thank you to everyone who has supported our work on those campaigns, and that is what we are hoping to do to contribute to the addressing these long-term climate goals and equity goals that we all have. And so taking it back to Teresa, I think we've touched on different ways that San Francisco has been a leader among other cities in addressing climate change. And we could add more to that, or we could speak as well to some lessons we can learn on leadership from other cities, because there are other cities doing good things, not just us.
Yeah, there certainly are. And I do think that we've already covered quite a laundry list, I think, of things that I, for one, am very impressed with San Francisco's leadership on. Parking kind of being the first to adopt a vehicle miles traveled threshold instead of level of service. And in addition to that, a few other aspects of, at the time it was called the Transportation Sustainability Program, but there were two other aspects to that, one of which was kind of looking at our transportation impact fees, and the other of which was implementing a transportation demand management ordinance to just make sure that when projects are coming online in San Francisco, that they're funding the things that are aligned with San Francisco's priorities, and not just, and that they are required to provide at least some level of support for their future workers or residents or visitors in terms of using transit, connecting to programs, having that like bike access. And I think that the coordination between those items is something that I've not really seen elsewhere. I think that also, just generally speaking, when we look into future leadership, I'd like to see us maybe look to different regions of the country where we're able to kind of integrate some of those additional services more seamlessly with San Francisco. So San Francisco has the highest transit mode share and probably the best transit coverage in the Bay Area. However, especially with the cost to live and work in San Francisco, we have a lot of people coming and going from the city every day. And when it comes to transit, the primary sort of arterials into the city are going to be BART and Caltrain. But if we're looking especially at kind of changing those non-commute trips, people who might come to San Francisco to visit, to experience, you know, some aspects other than just working here, having the supportive infrastructure across the entire region in order to help people get to and from the city is going to be really important in the long run. Climate change, as we know, is not does not really follow city boundaries, and that regional coordination is something that I think is really the next step in trying to look at our climate goals.
Thanks, Teresa. That definitely rings true in some of the work I've done. I was working on a study for District 4 in the Sunset, and in analyzing the data, we saw a lot of the trips that are driving are happening to the peninsula, and we definitely need to think regionally to address these issues of mode shift and having a seamless regional transportation network, transit network. And so a question for all the panelists before we get to, or a couple of questions for all the panelists before we get to the Q&A in the chat and in the Q&A box. What structures and system changes do we need to accomplish our goals? And how about we start with Debbie?
What structural and system changes? Oh my goodness. Well, I think, the chat has some really interesting questions in it, Han. So given that we need system change and structural change and political will, how do we actually accomplish that? And is it through democracy, or is there some other way? And we'll get to that later about the important work of advocacy. So I would say that we need our incentives aligned, and we need a system that puts a price on carbon. Honestly, I think that we need to make it expensive to do things that are not good for the climate. And we define that, we get to define it the way we want to. So that price on carbon is on things we buy. It's on the choices we make in terms of transportation. It's in the kind of energy we use in our homes. So for me, the biggest system change that we need, I believe, is our cap and trade system is wonderful in California. It generates a lot of money, but it's not a price on carbon that each of us feel. And I think until we have that, we won't see the big changes, the transformational changes. So I think that's number one. And then number two, in terms of structural and transformation change, we've got to figure out how to take care of our workforce that is dependent on fossil fuels. So that means retraining and getting jobs that aren't in that fossil fuel industry, or we're going to have a big war between labor and environment, and that is going to destroy us. So those are the two things that keep me up at night.
Thanks, Debbie. Yeah, I think having the individual feel the cost of carbon, I feel like those are debates and topics that Teresa and I went to graduate school together, and that was a common thing that would come up in economics discussions. And yeah, retraining the workforce, I think that's where we see a lot of reluctancy from legislators in other states about really advancing, ambitious climate legislation, because, their states depend on fossil fuel jobs. And so,
and it's not even just other states, it's inland California.
Different parts of
the Bay Area. Yeah, we've got it here, and it can't be solved really at the city level. So that's where we definitely need what I call that vertical integration between city, state, and feds to be in alignment on that. Yeah.
Teresa and Sarah, anything to add to kind of structures and system changes we need?
I have some things that might get me into trouble.
You are speaking as yourself
into this panel. So, I already mentioned funding really. I mean, we need to have different sources of funding, and that's going to take some pretty significant structural changes, I think, to do it. But one of the things that is very difficult to reconcile with, these long-term and citywide or larger than citywide goals is our governance system. And, that is both for the Bay Area as a whole, but also within San Francisco itself. We have we have our mayor, we have our board of supervisors, each of whom are representing their districts. And it's really difficult to get people to rally around what are going to be, some pretty, I don't want to say painful trade-offs, because I truly believe in the end that many of these changes that we're going to make are going to have a lot of positive things about them for a lot of people. But they are change, and change is difficult, and that is pretty challenging to navigate within our current political system that we have. So, we need to find that space, or really make that space, to be able to talk about and actively address, the levels of change that we need to put forward for the future, for the time when our leaders aren't in office anymore, and when those of us who are of a certain age aren't running the world anymore, and need to kind of be able to think about that. And then a much smaller thing, and perhaps less controversial, would be just funding planning. I saw some questions in the Q&A and in the chat about like, well, we can't do this piece by piece. We have to do a big picture. And, I could not agree more. But I think, as anybody who's done this work on any level knows, it is very difficult to get funding to do this kind of planning work, to set ourselves up to know what actions we need to do and how we need to do them. And so that's hopefully an easier system to change than changing our whole San Francisco electoral system.
Teresa?
I mean, yeah, I agree completely with everything that Debbie and Sarah have both said. I think that they covered a lot of the heavy hitters. I guess I'll go back to my regionalism spiel and just say that really, again, San Francisco, as wonderful as it is, as much as we're able to have like fantastic resources for travel within the city, is not an island. And I think that making sure that are trying to just build some way of having partnerships with the cities around us, the larger Bay Area, in all honesty, to address those sorts of same land use concerns, the transit integration concerns, the provision of workable transit to different types of places, especially as, again, we see this kind of diaspora out of San Francisco for many people, and making sure that we have systems that work that don't rely on personal vehicles to get to and from this wonderful city, I think is going to be very important. Again, that kind of harkens to the changing governance systems. I don't know that it's an easy change. I don't know that it's a feasible change. Local control is a storied tradition in California, but I do think that it's one area where I would really like to see at least a little bit of headway.
And so one last question for all the panelists. Why is it important to have strong advocates in order to reach our goals? And what does effective advocacy and community partnership look like to you? And I think some of the responses of this last question kind of lead into where we fit into the political will as San Francisco transit riders and other advocates.
I can shake it up and answer that. Throw my answer out. Give Debbie a break.
Go for it, Sarah.
Yeah, I love and I'm very grateful to our advocates. As city staff, we have certain responsibility. I mean, our role is to make sure we're understanding the full range of considerations and issues, and balance that out and work through solutions that are really thinking through kind of who benefits, who's burdened, how do we make sure that balances out correctly. But advocates play a really important role in providing that voice. Specifically the transit riders, as I mentioned. I mean, it's transit isn't like bicycle. It's not like the bike coalition where people really identify with, I ride a bicycle, or many people who ride bicycles really value that experience at a certain level, and are invested in it as, an aspect of identity. Transit is more like food. You need it just to function in your life, or particularly, in an urban environment. It is essential to the lifeblood of this city, and it's just it is very difficult for people to talk about and advocate for this very difficult system to fund and run, just from the space of their daily lives. And so I think that transit advocacy is really, really important to define and create that full set of voices and needs, and articulate why people need transit, and then, connect that need for transit with our elected officials, who need to be accountable to their constituents. They're not accountable. Elected officials aren't accountable to staff. They're accountable to people, and to constituents, and advocates play a really important role in being able to rally and articulate people's needs.
Teresa, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I want to harken back to something that Sarah mentioned earlier, which is the universal human fact that change is hard. We all know that change is hard. We know that people react poorly to kind of the idea that something about their life will need to change. But every time we have advocates kind of step up and say that they want that change, it helps break down that barrier a little bit, build up that political will, and really help people to see what is actually needed by the people who are using transit to get around the city, or walking around the city. I think that that's honestly the most important thing from just an elected official's point of view, is having this face to put kind of against the folks who might be a little bit more scared of the change, and presenting this other point of view that change will be worth it, that this is important to us as a community, that this is where we really want to, exercise what power we do have. I think that just that simple personalization is super important to the world of advocacy.
Wow, I love that. Change is worth it, right? At the bottom line, that is what advocates need to convey, is change is worth it. So when I think about advocacy, like Sarah, as a person who, well, for me, I've dedicated my career to public service, and being a public servant is a very particular role. And what has made my career, worthwhile and feeling like it's meaningful, is when we as public servants can be aligned with the advocacy world to push forward for change. And San Francisco is very lucky to have such strong and effective advocacy organizations like Transit Riders. I think for me as a climate policy person, it's really easy to feel overwhelmed. And people ask me, how do you come to work every day just reading the IPCC reports or seeing the extinction rates or everything that's happening with heat impacts? And I think it's the danger for all of us is to be overwhelmed by the problem statement such that we feel isolated or frozen. This idea of becoming apathetic because the problem is too big. And really the antidote to that anxiety, that eco-anxiety that I think so many of us feel, is really action. And action comes from each of us starting as individuals to looking at ourselves as organizations, to thinking of ourselves as communities, to societies. And I truly believe, and I've seen it over and over again in my career, that the world is run by those who show up. It really is. And that there are so many different ways to show up in this world. And the activist community, transit riders showing up in all sorts of different venues and places with different voices, that's where power is. And that's how we're going to convince people that change is worth it, that we have the elected officials back so that they can make hard decisions. So I can't think of anything more important than the role of the advocate in San Francisco or in any city in this country. It's the basis of democracy. So thank you, transit riders.
Thank you, Debbie. That was beautiful. I think what you and Teresa spoke to is true. Like, that's why advocacy groups like the transit riders exist, putting a face, being there to back up leaders who are willing to be bold when necessary. And that's definitely much appreciated. And so now we'll do a quick lightning question before we get to the Q&A for the panelists. What systems, transit systems around the world do you have transit envy, and why? Sarah, do you want to go first?
Sure. A couple of years ago, I was in Barcelona, and I just, the city itself is so awesome. And part of the reason it can be that way is because its transit system is terrific. But one of the things that I really loved about it was, you've got the subway, but within the neighborhoods, there was sort of small scale transit, even like cute little teeny buses that were accessing things, and they just made it possible to have this city that is much denser than San Francisco, but feels 10 times more livable.
Debbie?
Yeah, I was lucky enough to go to Copenhagen before the pandemic. And I think the thing, everybody talks about the bicycles in Copenhagen, but the thing that blew me away was the ethos of being on a bike. Like, being on a bike, you were with your child, you do everything on a bike, and the city is designed to make that possible. So bike parking, safety, the way the streets are designed, and then just the idea that you would drop your child off at daycare on a bike and then go to work. It was just so ingrained in just the way people did things there. And then the way they made it beautiful, the way they used artistic thinking for their bicycle bridges, so that the bicycle, which is a transportation element, becomes part of the fabric of the design of the city in such a way that it's beautiful. Anyway, I was blown away by that and very envious.
Teresa?
I am tragically not as well traveled as I would like to be, but I'll kind of go, I'll buck the trend a little bit. I have definitely been to a few cities where their transit was just fantastic. I'm just going to say one thing I really loved about visiting Mexico City in particular is the iconography on the metro. Every station has its own independent icon. The design is fantastic. I enjoy it so much. And the metro in Mexico City is also quite useful. It's well integrated. I also appreciate kind of the versatility of the way that transit has evolved there, such that there is the metro, but then as needed, what can I say? I'm a sucker for bus rapid transit, and they do have kind of very prototypical BRT, in addition to a number of sort of ad hoc transportation systems that people have set up, honestly, just to help, make their lives a little bit more livable in this humongous, like incredibly dense city that has a wide range of different types of people living in it.
Thanks, everyone. And now we'll get to the Q&A that have been compiled from the chat. First, the first question is for Sarah and Debbie. Of the 41% reduction of GHG, how much of that can be attributed to transportation? And how has transportation's contribution changed in recent years?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, most of the reduction has come from the energy sector and not the transportation sector. So the transportation sector has gone down by around 9%, whereas the energy sector has gone down almost 80%. So, and then you get to 41% because they are different percents of the whole contribution. So I didn't bring slides with all the math, but it's exactly the right question, is that the transportation sector has gone down mostly because of fuel efficiency and because of the carbon intensity of fuels. But in terms of number of cars on the road, and this is what Sarah was getting at, is let's just assume we stay at 50% mode shift. If our population goes up, we still have more cars on the road. So we need to drastically deal with mode shift because our population is on the rise as our GDP arises and as we build more housing. So it's a tricky thing, and it's why we need electrification at the same time that we need mode shift. Otherwise, we'll never get GHG reductions because of that dynamic. Sarah, did I get it right?
That captures it. I mean, you know, definitely the transportation emissions are, you know, very much tied to cars for sure. And you know, one thing that is especially tricky about that is that while we can do a lot of work reducing the emissions from our transit vehicles and from modes of transit themselves, those are just a tiny portion of the transportation related emissions. And so to bring those numbers down, we do really need to be taking actions that are going to affect the choices people make and affect you know, also deal with the fuel efficiency side of things, and also make it more possible not to use cars through our land use decisions and through, you know, a whole variety of strategies.
There was a related question, Sarah, about kind of wanting you to elaborate more on efficiency, and I think how you're rethinking that metric of efficient trips, and if you could kind of speak more about how that's measured.
Yeah, so it's definitely a work in progress for sure, you know, even to the degree of what's the role of an electric vehicle in that whole assessment of what constitutes a low carbon trip. So, you know, I literally right before this panel, I was in a discussion that included MTA and the Transportation Authority and San Francisco Environment about that. So we're really working on it, and I want you to all keep an eye on what's going on with it. But I can talk a little bit about how we got to the place of understanding that we needed to do this. And it was around this struggle around electrification, and you know, recognizing that electrification of vehicles is not as easy as, you know, you can't just plug it into some plug in your, you know, in your house and then be done. And especially in a city like San Francisco, where, you know, people don't necessarily even have their own parking area and charging area, nor do we want them to. You know, if we're managing for parking, we need to really think about this whole infrastructure. So there is a role for SFMTA in making sure that electrification can work in terms of what we do with our streets and our parking infrastructure. So we needed to, and that's really important. And we needed to recognize the value and the importance of doing that in our transportation work. So that was where we came to, okay, we have this one goal area about emissions that we really need to make sure we have a set of strategies to deal with. And one set of those strategies is electrification, and one set of those strategies is mode shift. But then, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, all of the other things that we are trying to do with our transportation system, you know, what it came down to as the thing that we always think about in making these choices is, how do we use our street space and what's the most efficient way to do it? How many essentially passenger miles are you getting for the car miles? And how are we enabling that or preventing that? So that's where we came to the conclusion that, like, we need to really have a metric where we are explicitly talking about that. So so we know we need the metric. We know that there are certain modes that pretty clearly achieve that metric. Basically, you know, priority, walk, bike, bus. And then we, you know, still have this like somewhat messy middle on both of these metrics about carpooling and about, you know, well, what about how do you deal with occupancy and how do you deal with all these things? So definitely still working on it. That's some of the stuff that we're thinking about. And I really welcome any thoughts or ideas. I know a number of people on this call, and I know you're all smart and care a lot about this, or you wouldn't be spending your evening this way, except that my mother's on this call. She's just on here to see how all her hard work went raising me. But yeah, I want to hear people's thoughts, you know, in an ongoing way as we go through this work in the coming months.
Great, thanks, Sarah. I think there was a related question that you actually answered about where electric cars are in kind of the low carbon trip, and it sounds like it's in kind of this gray area that where I think capacity matters. It's not just because it's electric. That's kind of where the efficiency.
Yeah, and I just want to weigh in a little bit about electrification and these ideas of not thinking of the city as one uniform landmass. We have areas where electrification is going to be very important. And I was on a call earlier today looking at air quality in the Bayview and looking at the Department of Public Health maps of where the particulate matter emissions from diesel are really impacting the ability of our residents to breathe and to live healthy lives. And most of that diesel is coming from trucks, and it's coming from the freight goods movement. And so when I think about electrification, there is the world of passenger vehicles, and passenger vehicles are 70% of our emissions. And the solutions for passenger vehicles is obviously not to have them, you know, to minimize them. The freight vehicles is different. I mean, there the solution is not public transit. The solution is we have to find a way of moving goods that doesn't contaminate our environment. And their electrification is critically important. And can we think about fast charging hubs that serve those freight industries, but also have the ability to help multifamily residents as well, should they need a vehicle, and could it be electric? So I think that the conversations that I know that we're having with MTA and with CTA is to be much more specific about what we mean by electrification. And it doesn't only mean that everyone should drive a Tesla. In fact, it doesn't mean that. It means that we're looking at where is it so important for us to get off of diesel and gasoline.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Debbie. And I feel like in terms of freight, I think that's a place where San Francisco is a little behind than, like, say, Los Angeles, for sure. And we can look to other places to see what they're doing. And there's a question for, I think, Teresa. You mentioned that there are a few studies on the efficacies of different TDM strategies or other climate reduction strategies. Why is that? Why is there not a lot of studies on how efficient these strategies can be in addressing GHG reduction? And how can we change that? And I think there's a desire to, like, have best practices defined as this is the most effective way that we can do this, but it's not necessarily that clear, it seems, based on your research and literature reviews I'm sure you've done.
Yeah, and that is very specific to, individual travel behavior and mode choice. And it's because those decisions are really messy. People have a lot of different things that they're balancing whenever they're choosing how they want to travel, which includes, maybe at some level, a program here and there, or, whether or not the bus comes every 12 minutes instead of every 15 minutes. But it's a combination of the difficulty of kind of sussing out individual variables and how much they affect something, with honestly going back to the change is difficult, and we often find ourselves sort of working in increments out of necessity, rather, even though we know that it's not necessarily the ideal way to do something. And that means that there are not a whole bunch of natural experiments, so to speak, where we have information from before something was implemented and information from after it was implemented. And so I'd say that those are the two primary reasons why we don't necessarily have all the information we would want, either because it's really hard to control for certain variables or determine whether or not they're present, or just because we don't have before and afters, because change is hard, and programs get implemented at very incremental levels.
Yes, I think that's a fair point. It's like we're trying these strategies incrementally, and the way people make decisions is very, very messy and hard to isolate.
Yeah, and there are good studies out there, particularly when it comes to sort of the larger relationship between land use types and neighborhoods and how people, can choose to travel. But yeah, there's a lot of noise. There's also an issue of the way that people present their findings. So for instance, in cases where, say, we increase transit service, not every new transit trip would have otherwise been taken by car. So oftentimes it'll be presented as, say, a change in transit ridership, but then there's no information on, say, how much of that demand is, like opportunistic or induced versus truly like people who otherwise would have gotten into their car and driven.
Right, because we could be adding a transit improvement, but we're taking away from another transit line. Like those people are
precisely
that, rather than truly shifting people from the car mode to the transit mode.
Correct.
Yeah. And so a question for Debbie that I think was at the beginning of the chat was, how does the Department of the Environment influence MTA and other agencies to actually
that's a really unfair question to ask me in public. So yeah, I know the person who asked it, and yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic. Not every city has a Department of Environment. San Francisco has one. The department was created in the 90s because it was created by charter amendment, because the residents of San Francisco were very frustrated with city agencies. They felt like they weren't paying enough attention to environmental initiatives. And in fact, the first climate plan was created by the community, not by the city itself. And it was sort of given to the city, here, this is our best work. And then the Department of the Environment and the Commission on the Environment came out of that. So the department has had a very interesting evolution since 1997, when it was first adopted or first put into place. We get no general fund money. So all of the funding for our department comes from either money we raise in grants, work orders from other city departments, or from the garbage rates from part of your ecology bill. So what that means is we have a tricky relationship also with city agencies, because they fund us to do things as well through work orders. So it's a very interesting relationship. I think the mayor knows, and the board knows, and my fellow department heads know, that the reason the Department of the Environment is here is to sort of be that conscience for other city departments to remind them, because they have so many things on their plates, right? The head of MTA, Jeff Tumlin, has so many competing interests that he has to deal with, and it's true for all the other city department heads. And so my role is to be there to say, all right, Jeff or Phil or whoever I'm talking, Ivar, doesn't matter who I'm talking with, you know, how can I help you be more successful at meeting environmental goals? What is it that's standing in your way? I mean, this is my style as a department head. There will be department heads, there were in the very beginning, where their style was more of shame and embarrassment, hold to account. My personal philosophy is that is maybe a short-term feel-good strategy, but it's not a long-term effective strategy. So the long-term effective strategy is for me to find where MTA and Department of the Environment share common goals and alignment. And I think this whole climate action plan process has been an amazing way for Jeff and Tilly from the CTA and staff to work together to find those commonalities to make sure that we're not putting something in the plan that gets in the way of what MTA is trying to accomplish. And at the same time, let's make sure that those definitions, for example, of a sustainable or low carbon or efficient trip are really pushing us in the direction of our environmental goals as well as our equity goals. So how do we influence? It's a lot of different ways. Sometimes we write grants together and work on projects together. We work on surveys together. Right now, we're working on a survey with MTA to figure out how we're going to deal with charging, and do we even want charging at the curb? A lot of other cities do that. Is that something that makes sense here? So we're a thought partner, but we're also, as I said, cajoler, and at the end of the day, we file reports that show how we're doing on progress. So we hold our departments to account by saying, here's how we're doing on transportation. Here's how you are doing, MTA, on your own contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. Here's how you are doing on your contributions to zero waste. We audit and we give that data back to the departments in a very public way to help them move forward. So I talk to department heads a lot about their environmental accomplishments or challenges, depending on what the data show.
Thanks, Debbie. I think that answers that question really well. I think it's important to know the history of how the department was created, and that, yeah, you're keeping the entire city accountable to these ambitious goals that we have. And we're almost out of time, but there is one big question that I want to get to. And let's see, it's very long, but so we're talking about the 80% sustainable mode share goal, and as commensurate with international benchmark like the IEA's 2050 net zero scenario. And so I think this person was asking that, was considering how 95% of our street space is allocated to cars. So how, it seems like we need to reallocate, like radically reallocate that street space over the next 10 years if we are going to achieve kind of our ambitious goals. And so what is anyone, the question is anyone working on mapping out a plan for this in San Francisco to match the ambitious goals, and what would that look like? And this might be a question for Sarah.
Yes, absolutely. I love this question, and I think it's spot on. And yes, we are mapping out a plan, and that that is a big sort of piece and purpose of Connect SF, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about, which has been kind of started in a very abstract vision space, and then moved into the work effort over the work effort that we're kind of wrapping up now, which is really looking at these different modes and networks and doing studies and developing strategies for what we need to do in all of them. And that came out with a pretty aggressive strategy around transit that is that really is talking about what street space needs to look like in order to support the transit system that we need. And everybody, you know, kind of gets focused on like the big fancy projects in it, but I think that what's more important in that transit investment strategy is the notion of a 5-minute network and the street changes that are needed to do that, which really are a piece of real radical reallocation of our street space and how our surface rail works. There is also a companion streets and freeways study, as well as an active transportation study. And now we are moving into the next stage of it, which is finally, after decades, we're updating San Francisco's transportation element of its general plan. A lot of cities, kind of use their general plan much more than San Francisco does, but the transportation element is something that I am really excited about because it is where all of these pieces will come together and these networks will get mapped out, and we can move from this, you know, street by street, project by project thinking about it to a more holistic approach. And so that's, you know, that's where we are right now. And we're also in the context of that effort, thinking about what we're calling a modal framework, where we do have ways to make those decisions about street space based on the needs that a street needs to serve. So we've got a lot of exciting planning stuff going on for just the reasons that Zach mentions in his question. And then the last piece of that I do want to mention is we also got funding to update our bicycle plan and really focus on mode shift and equity in the context of bicycles and taking advantage of all this cool new offerings and technologies to you know, kind of bring our thinking about bikes back into a place of bikes as a mode and their role in our transportation landscape.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that harkens back to your point earlier about more planning is needed, and that's where this will happen, where we reallocate the space. And so that concludes our panel tonight. Thank you, Debbie, Teresa, and Sarah. Kat, I don't know if you have any other closing announcements that you need to make for Transit Month. As a reminder, come to our party on Friday, but I'll leave it to Kat to make any other announcements.
Come to our party on Friday, register now so I know how many tacos the taco truck has to have. Tacos and beers on the Bayside. It's a beautiful location, Mariposa, Hunters Point Yacht Club, where I remember I get to have these lovely parties there. The only other announcement I have to say is, like, I just want to thank you all so much. It really amazing conversation, amazing group of leaders, all of you, Sarah and Debbie and Teresa and Camille. Like, great, so great to work with all of you, and I hope this has been a really wide-ranging conversation, and we've been able to get pretty deep on some things, but I also see it as sort of the first of hopefully more conversations as we go through these planning processes and hold ourselves accountable to our climate goals as we go forward. Thank you so much for participating, for all your support. Thank you, Fehr and peers, for sponsoring this event and for all your work, and I hope to continue to partner with you as well. So yeah, I don't know if anybody else has any last words. But
thank you.
Thank you. This was so much fun.
Thank you. This was great. Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. Good night.